As a child, I remember my father telling me stories. Stories that scared the crap out of me, honestly. Like stories that terrified me. Stories about boogeymen. Not the monstrous Jason, Freddy Krueger type boogeymen. No, the boogeymen that were real, that could exist. I remember him telling me legends about crazed killers, like psychotic men who escaped from prison and sought to spread blood all around. Surprisingly, I grew up normal for the most part, but those stories always stuck with me, and perhaps that's why I've become a horror writer as an adult, is that there's something about those horrific, terrifying stories that get to us. Those urban legends that tell us about hook-handed killers, or the things that hide in the woods, or the things that hide in your closet. All those terrifying ideas, they resonate with us as a human race. And so I decided to do this podcast. I wanted to look at urban legends, but I wanted to look at stories that shape our childhood, stories that shape our psyche, that give us in many ways our morals, our guidelines for what's okay and what's not in life. And so I decided to call this podcast Urban Legends Unmasked. And so each week we're going to look at some urban legends, and we are going to analyze, not just like where they came from, what's their historical background. We are going to look deeper into it. We're going to look into what it does to affect the sociological mindset. How do urban legends shape our collective behaviors? And maybe even our individual behaviors. And so today, on our first ever episode of the Urban Legends Unmasked podcast, we are going to dive into the first legend my father ever taught me, the Hookman. This is Urban Legends Unmasked, and I am your host, Chad Lehrman. My father was raised in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. He was born in 1943, and in the 1950s and 1960s was sort of the high era, if you will, for urban legends, at least in the 20th century. Before it became sort of technologically advanced, and we got things like Slenderman and the entirety of creepypasta. Before all of that came along, it was just good old-fashioned psycho killers in the woods chasing down teenagers. And that's the stories that my father taught me. And the one that I remember the most would be the Hookman legend. And I heard various versions of it over time, but essentially the legend that my father told me was that a couple had gone out on a date. They were hanging out in their car, doing what teenagers do, which, you know, to my 11 or 12-year-old self, when he first told me this, I didn't know. But for those of you who are kind of not in the know, they were like doing things that teenagers do in cars in the 50s. They were like making out, having sex, whatever. So the point was this, that these children were doing things. They were hanging out in the car, and as the story went on, the boy was pressuring the girl, and the girl began to feel uncomfortable. And the girl then began to hear noises, the sounds of things outside, and she began to get scared. So the boyfriend turns on the radio to kind of calm her down and maybe set the mood a little bit. And as he turns on the radio, the music stops for just a second, and this scary voice comes on of a terrified newscaster. Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, we have word that there is an escaped killer from the local prison, from the county prison. He's murdered 7 people, and he was in prison for life, and he is out, and he is on the prowl. So if you are in these locations, be very careful. And if you see a man with a hook for a hand, steer clear. Call the police. And of course, the girlfriend gets freaked out because one of the areas they mentioned is where they happen to be. And the boyfriend is, you know, like a teenage boy. He doesn't care. Like he's got one thing on his mind, and hook-handed killers chasing him down in the park, not one of those things. And so the boyfriend decides to, you know, try to calm the girlfriend down, but then they hear something. They hear a scraping noise on the side of the car, and the boyfriend begins to freak out too. Like it's finally like all of the hormonal like desire for him to, you know, have sex and do all those things is gone, and it's survival instinct, and he throws the car into reverse, drives off, and drives the girl home, pulls into her driveway, and as he gets out to go and let her out of the car, because remember, this was in the 50s and, you know, chivalry. So he gets out to open the car door, and there hanging on the car handle is a bloody hook with a stump of blood pouring off. For those of you who aren't going to get the subtlety of that, the hook hand was on the door by the girl about to open the door, and when he pulled off, he ripped the hook hand off of the killer and they escaped. Now that's the version my dad taught me. The bloody gory stuff is probably why I write bloody gory stuff. But also that version of the story, the boy and the girl survive. They survive by not giving in to those urges. And so as I've grown up and as I've become an adult and I've become a psychology and a sociology teacher in the high school, I actually started doing an urban legend unit because I'm fascinated by these things. I'm fascinated by these stories that shape us and give us morality and perhaps even teach us these little modern Aesop's fables with a dark tinged edge. I really love that. I think there's something very interesting and intriguing about that. And so when I began to teach that lesson, I began to recognize that so many of these urban legends are teaching the morality of the time. What is an acceptable behavior? What is not an acceptable behavior? Good behaviors are rewarded. Unacceptable behaviors are punished. And so in other versions of the hook hand legend, the boy doesn't quit. The boy, trying to show off macho bravado, he gets out of the car to go investigate and he gets hacked and slashed. And maybe in some version he's hung from a tree. And when you combine two different legends, the fingernails scraping on the roof legend, he's hanging from the tree and the fingers are scraping on the roof. And other versions, they both die. You know, that's kind of the thing is that the moral of that story is that if you're going to go out and have premarital sex, you are going to die. That is the moral of that story. And so that story was told to scare teenagers into being chaste and being pure and staying away from things. And I would, being a child of the 80s and 90s, we still heard those stories and teen pregnancy was still relatively a high thing. So I don't think it worked. But it did leave something in our mindset. It did leave something in our sort of psyche that there is something that if bad things are going to happen to you when you do this, maybe you shouldn't do that thing. And so that began to be in the mindset of America. And so then you begin to look at what happens in the movies that come along in the 60s and the 70s, especially the 70s and 80s with your slashers. You develop these rules. And one of those rules is that if you have sex in a horror movie, you're going to die. Famously, Scream kind of lampoons that and points that out. Like you have Randy explaining in the movie, hey, if you commit sins, if you sleep around, if you do drugs, if you drink, you're gonna die. That's the rules in the movies, folks. And what he's really getting at is this idea that our legends begin to teach us these things. They begin to teach us what's right and what's not right. And so it would be one thing if this legend had absolutely no truth to it. If there was nothing like this had ever happened. The problem is that this legend, like all legends, has some foundation in truth. Now, my dad, like I said, was born in the 1940s, and so he would have been too young probably to remember what happened a long, long time ago in Texarkana, at least not in the original version of it. He would not have remembered what happened basically like as it happened. He would not have remembered that. He would have remembered the stories being told and the things that came along after that. In 1946, when my father was 3 years old, in Texarkana, Texas, there were the Moonlight Murders, in which a series of teens parked in cars were murdered. There you go. Your legend has some basis in this. That obviously the hook-handed man, he begins to take on certain things. He begins to take on certain qualities. There are images of that. If you've ever seen the movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which, by the way, I also saw at a relatively young age and kind of explaining this legend, I'll never forget the scene where the guy uses a trombone to kill somebody. Like, I don't think that was actually what happened, but man, that stuck with me. So the point is that particular story began to inform and it began to shape the legend. Then you flash forward to one of the most famous serial killers in all of American history, the Zodiac Killer. Zodiac Killer does much of the same thing. He finds young couples, he punishes them for behaviors that, we don't think are okay. And so the legend becomes life. Legend becomes reality. And guess what? People began to be afraid. People began to fear going to these places that would have been safe, would have been normal ordinarily, and not do those things. Legends have power. Now, the other thing that's super scary about this is that neither one of those guys were ever caught. We never caught the Moonlight Murder. We never caught the Zodiac. And so like that lingers in our mindset. And it really, I think you have this sort of circular thing that begins to happen with the legend. So the legend probably is informed by what happened in Texarkana. Kids parking their cars, kids making out, killers coming in, taking them out. And then the legend begins to take on a life of its own. And I don't know if the Zodiac was informed by the legend or perhaps by the prior murders, but the fact is that they built on each other. And that legend began to become a part of who we are. And so you've all probably heard some version of this legend. And maybe it was even taught to you by your parents as a cautionary tale. When you're going out on a date, make sure you do not park in a secluded area to make out with your boyfriend or girlfriend. This is going to end up badly for you. And that legend sticks with us. And that's really why I want to do this podcast. It's because the legends that we hear, the legends that stick to us, they teach us something. I've never been parking in a car in a secluded region because I don't want to be murdered by a Hookman. Very honestly. Like, I behave in ways. I look under my car sometimes. I check the back seat. I do all these things because these legends tell me to do them, even if it's never happened or it's not real. But we buy into it because the legends speak to something innate in us, something that's natural, something that's primitive in us. Our fear. Fear is vital to who we are. It shapes us. It can handicap us, or it can make us who we're meant to be. But fear is a powerful tool. And if you were handicapped by fear, if you were halted or stopped by your fear, the only way to overcome that is to unmask it. So as we continue with Urban Legends Unmasked, as this podcast goes on, and I'm hoping to publish once a month, here at the beginning to kind of get things rolling, I want you to have some say on what we talk about. Now, I shared this legend. It's probably one you've heard 1,000 times. There's nothing new that I really brought to it, I don't think, at this point. But what I really want to do is I want to hear from you. I want to hear the legends that you want us to talk about, that you want to know, how does it affect us? What's the sociological, psychological components of it? How does it affect communities? What happens there? But even more than that, I also believe that every small town out there has its own legend, has a story that informs the culture of that town, that causes the locals to behave in a different way, to maybe look at that tree a little differently, or never walk down that road after dark, or that cemetery is one you stay away from. All of those legends are powerful. And I'm not a folklorist, I'm not a scientist in this regard, but I want to collect your stories, and I want to share your stories to other people. And so in the coming weeks, I'll be trying to do a mix of established urban legends, things that we've already heard, things that you guys have seen before, Hookman and Pop Rocks and Coke, and probably not that one, that's kind of lame, but like some of the others that are along those lines. But I'd love to hear from you. Like, let me know your local legends. And I'll also try to sprinkle in some of the local legends that I grew up with. There's a famous one from my hometown of Mart, Texas. It's actually not Mart, it's actually Otto, Texas, which is nearby Mart, but of Hope Cemetery, of this supposedly haunted cemetery, which my friends and I were bold and stupid enough to investigate one night when we were about 13 years old. So I'll share that at some point. But how do these legends shape you? And so please reach out, comments. Please share the podcast. You can follow more of what I do. I'm also a writer. That's kind of why I've been doing a podcast that's more on ethics and education, and nobody watched that. So I decided that I would really want to share this podcast. I would really want to share this kind of thing because it's really in line with what I write. I write horror and supernatural type thriller stuff with the occasional actual nonfiction book as well. But if you like those things, check me out on Amazon. I'm Chad Lehrman, Lehrmann, and you can also find me on TikTok as Chad_the_writer. And I'm also on Instagram as Chad_Lehrmann_author. So those are my things to find. Please check out my books. Please check out the podcast, and we'll look forward to you seeing us next time on Urban Legends Unmasked.